Max Verstappen overtook both Ferraris and survived Charles Leclerc's challenge following a late safety car to win the first Miami Grand Prix. Welcome to the Grand Prix cap for the Miami Grand Prix here on the 5 Red Lights F1 podcast. I'm your host and my name is Aaron Harper. In this episode I'll be sharing my thoughts on the race in Florida, rating every driver's performance and assessing the event as a whole. This podcast can be found on most podcast platforms and on YouTube, along with many other videos, like the Flying Lap, where I review the race and the headlines faster than the pole position lap time. Like, follow or subscribe wherever you're listening or watching, and if you could be kind enough to rate the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or just with a YouTube comment, it would be greatly appreciated. You can find me on Twitter at 5_red_lights for my Formula 1 views, and at AaronHarper41 for my perspective on the wider world of sport. And you can also follow me on Instagram at 5 Red Lights. Now then, let's get into the Miami Grand Prix cap. So the story of the weekend is as follows. We'll start from FP1 as per usual. Leclerc topped FP1 ahead of George Russell and Max Verstappen as everyone sought to get to grips with the circuit and the tricky track surface. Valtteri Bottas was the first driver to say hello to the barriers, spinning off at turn 7. Mercedes appeared to have fixed the porpoising issue they've been suffering with all season, and they were quick with their upgrades to the front and rear wings. A dramatic FP2 was topped by George Russell as first Carlos Sainz and then Nicholas Latifi brought out red flags. Sainz spun off at the now sort of infamous turn 14-15 chicane, hitting the wall, and Nicholas Latifi lost drive later on in the session. There were also reliability woes for Max Verstappen as he appeared to have hydraulics issue following a gearbox change from free practice 1 where he tapped the wall on the exit of turn 16. So the team had changed the gearbox with damage visible to them, and then there was a hydraulics problem later on in the day. Moving to FP3, Esteban Ocon, he had a shunt in the same place as Carlos Sainz, a 51G impact, which kind of triggered a little bit of a response from the drivers. They weren't happy that there was no Tech Pro barriers there, and if you're having a second or third gear accident and you're registering 51G, that's kind of worrying, because when there's no give in like a concrete wall, there's nothing there to absorb the impact except the car and then the driver's body. So the FIA need to really sort of sharpen up on that, and there's no excuse for it because this is a new track and it's not like Tech Pro is a new thing. So the FIA just sort of buried their heads in the sand over it, unfortunately, and the drivers were left confused and probably felt a little bit endangered. So FP3 was topped by Sergio Perez ahead of Charles Leclerc and Max Verstappen, but Mercedes crucially appeared to have taken a step back, which meant they looked like they were out of the fight for pole position. Who would bring the heat in qualifying? Well, it wasn't Hamilton or Alonso because they needed late laps to get through to safety in Q1. Esteban Ocon was eliminated, having not even turned a wheel because there was a crack found in his chassis from that 51G impact. Kevin Magnussen was the surprise elimination in 16th, while Bottas squeaked through in 15th. He'd missed the entirety of FP2 on Friday, so that was kind of expected that he'd be lower down the order and sort of maybe still getting up to speed a little bit with the track. So out in Q1 were Magnussen, Zhou, Albarn, Latifi and obviously Esteban Ocon. Now the big casualty in Q2 was George Russell, who had actually topped free practice 2 about 24 hours previously, and he was only 12th. It was a bit of a scruffy session, Q2 for George Russell. He was joined out by Alonso, Vettel, Ricciardo and Schumacher, and the 11th, 12th and 13th drivers, Alonso, Russell and Vettel, were inside a tenth of a second of Pierre Gasly's time in P10. And as a whole, the 5 drivers who were eliminated were within 0.3 of Gasly's time. So that shows you just how competitive that midfield is. And kind of, that's how Formula 1 should be. If you make a mistake, you get punished. And if you do a really good job, then you've got a chance to get through. Because there were 3 surprise names in Q3. Lance Stroll's Alfa Romeo, Lance Stroll's Aston Martin, Yuki Tsunoda's Alfa Tauri and Valtteri Bottas' Alfa Romeo. Gosh, no wonder we get them confused because they all start with the letter A. Come on, guys, bring some different names, please. So let's move on to Q3. Ferrari looked out the front row after a Verstappen error on the final run. Verstappen had initially set the pace on their first runs. So it was an all-red front row. Charles Leclerc taking the pole position ahead of Carlos Sainz. Verstappen ahead of Sergio Perez on row 2. Then Valtteri Bottas, best of the rest in P5, considering he'd only just squeaked through into Q2. That was some effort to be P5 ahead of his former teammate Lewis Hamilton. And then rounding out the top 10 were Gasly, Norris, Tsunoda and Stroll. Leclerc nailed the final sector in his duel with Carlos Sainz, and it was the first Ferrari front row since Mexico 2019. Fast forward to race day, which arrives with celebrities absolutely everywhere, and Martin Brundle's grid walk on Sky, nothing short of absolute chaos. Let's gloss over that. And the lights went out. It was a good start for Charles Leclerc, but Max Verstappen got Carlos Sainz on the outside of turn 1, mustered his way through as they approached turn 2. Mercedes saw both their drivers drop back a couple of places, and as the opening laps unfolded, Charles Leclerc ran into some tyre wear on the right front tyre on his mediums, which allowed Verstappen to close up. Verstappen pounced on a slow Leclerc on the pit straight to take a lead that he would never lose on track. He would pit and lose the lead, I believe. I think Carlos Sainz led a couple of laps. And from lap 9 onwards, Verstappen was completely in control of the Grand Prix. A little bit later on, Sergio Perez reported a loss of power, which needed a sensor fail on his steering wheel, but he regained momentum. There was a bit of toing and froing from the driver to his engineer about what was actually going on. The data said everything was fine, and then Checo was saying, "Look at my lap times," and declaring very vociferous in that he was losing power. And then the pit wall recognised what was going on. At the front, it was pretty much status quo, and it was the Mercedes boys who were actually making a little bit of progress. They were both on different strategies. Hamilton starting on the mediums, Russell starting on the hards. They both started on the right-hand side of the grid, which was the dirty side of the grid, which might explain why they lost places. Russell lost a couple of extra places because he was on the hards and they took a little while to warm up. And unfortunately, the race suffered a heavy lull in the middle, and it was quite a prolonged period of not a lot going on. The cars just weren't able to attack, and anything that was happening we missed because the TV direction was not very good, and it's needed a little bit of an injection throughout the season. It was poor in Saudi Arabia. It's been poor pretty much all year, to be honest. Even DRS was not really enough to help the track action. There was a little bit of squabbling for the minor places, but everything kind of just seemed set, and without a safety car, nothing was really going to change. But we did get a safety car. Pierre Gasly and Lando Norris collided, sending the McLaren spinning out of the race. Lando thankfully was uninjured. The safety car was called, bunching up the field, and it gave us some excitement as Leclerc and Verstappen duelled for the lead in the final few laps. Sergio Perez had boxed for fresh mediums, but he was unable to make the pass stick on Carlos Sainz. He did send one down the inside into turn 1, but he ran too deep and was never able to complete the move. At the front, Leclerc lacked the straight line performance to really put Verstappen under too much stress, and once Verstappen broke the DRS, it was all over, bar the shouting. The Mercedes, they went into combat. It was pretty straightforward, to be honest, because they both knew that they weren't really fighting and they were only ever going to finish 5th and 6th, especially once Valtteri Bottas had made a mistake to let them through. So they duelled. I think Russell had to give the place back because he was ahead of Lewis, then he was behind, and then he retook the place. But he was on better tyres, so he was always going to make that pass. There was a late clash between Uncle Seb and Mick Schumacher, while Fernando Alonso pranked with Gasly earlier on, which kind of maybe contributed to Gasly's error, which led to the collision with Norris and the eventual safety car. Alonso also gained an advantage off track, which then saw him earn 2 5-second time penalties, which dropped him from 8th at the flag to 11th in the classification. And this promoted Albarn to 9th and Stroll to 10th. So the finishing order was Verstappen, Leclerc, Sainz, Perez, Russell, Hamilton, Bottas, Ocon, Albon, and then Stroll in the top 10. Verstappen's win cuts another 8 points from Leclerc's championship lead. Mattia Bonotto saying after the race that Ferrari needed to respond. That they very much must do in Spain, otherwise Verstappen and Red Bull will very quickly eat away at the advantage that Ferrari hold right now. So that's the story of the weekend. Let's get into my driver ratings. And as always, we'll go in Constructors' Championship order from the order that the teams entered the Miami Grand Prix weekend. So that means, again, we start with the Ferrari boys and Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz. Charles Leclerc kicks things off with the driver ratings again. So he started from pole position and he finished second. I give him a rating of 2.5. He delivered a wonderful pole lap, but he damaged the right front on the mediums. And that's not necessarily him. That's probably more a trait of the car, because it's heavier on the downforce in terms of actually producing pure downforce, and it corners very well, but that in turn seems to be hurting the front tyres. He did hustle Verstappen after the safety car, but he was limited by lack of top-end speed. He said after the race, "All in all, we had a good weekend here in Miami, so of course I'm disappointed to miss out on first place." But he'll be looking to move to Spain and pick up that third victory of the season. His teammate Carlos Sainz started alongside him on the front row in second place and finished in third. I also rate Carlos's performance as a 2.5. A solid drive, considering he hadn't completed more than 2 laps in race trim since the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. He had a sore neck from the FP2 crash, so third is a good effort really. Sainz said after the race, "I think I needed a race like this to reset a bit and build on it for the upcoming races." And, what better reset than just before your home race? And Carlos needs to break that duck of that maiden win early to give himself a chance within this championship. Otherwise, it is going to be Leclerc versus Verstappen. And if Mercedes, by some miracle, get their act together and start winning a couple of races and throw themselves into the championship hunt, Sainz will very quickly be condemned to number 2 status. So let's move to the race winner, Max Verstappen. Started third, finished first. Give him a rating of 4. It wasn't a completely perfect weekend because of the reliability issues, but he drove well. It was a winning weekend, and that's all it needs to be at the end of the day. He did pick up the fastest lap. He pushed Leclerc into damaging his tyres, and he got past. Minimum of fuss with the overtake. Eased into a lead, opened up a several second gap, controlled it, and defended very well after the safety car. He said, "It feels amazing to win in Miami. The whole atmosphere this weekend has been incredible, and to win in the US is always a nice feeling. It was a physically tough race. I think I must have lost around 3 kilograms. It was a tough race, and the top 3, when we saw them before their interviews with Willie T. Ribbs, they all looked pretty drained and exhausted, and it was a bit of a throwback to years gone by. Mansell getting out of the car and just buckets of sweat pouring off of him. I'm not saying we want to see that, because obviously these boys are much more athletic, and the stamina is much better than it was back in the 80s and 90s. But it's still good to see that they've had to really work, and for want of a better word, almost suffer a little bit, because when you sit in that cockpit and it's north of 50 degrees in the cockpit, you are suffering. Obviously, we don't want people collapsing when they get out of the car. Sort of Mansell again, mentioning him back in, I think it was in Dallas, that he tried to push the car over the line and collapsed. We don't want that, but it's nice to see that they've really had to work, because in years gone by, drivers got out and it was hardly a bead of sweat on them. So it was good to see them really work for this one. Sergio Perez in the second Red Bull started 4th and finished there too. I rate him at 2.5, hampered a bit by that sensor issue early on, which they say cost him something like 28 kilowatts or however many bhp that is. I think Martin Brundle worked it out. Arguably it cost him P3 in the pit stops because he'd dropped back a little bit and Sainz had a slow stop. He should have passed Sainz on the new tyres, but nonetheless still a good performance, backing up Verstappen. On another day he probably would have got past and maybe even got a 1-2, which he felt was lost with that sensor problem. Mercedes now, and well, they're the new Red Bull, because do you remember back in the 2017 and 2018 season when you had madness in the midfield and you had Ferrari and Mercedes at the front and Red Bull were just always 5th and 6th? That's where Mercedes are now. Lewis Hamilton started 6th, finished 6th. I'm going to rate Lewis as a 2. It's probably a bit harsh, but there is an amount of expectation that I have from Lewis. And I know he's probably still trying to get to grips with the car. It seems tricky to drive. I don't know. There's probably just a little bit of a hangover from 2021 as well. So once the car gets into a sweet spot, I think we'll see Lewis sort of return to that top form. He's not quite as in tune with this car as he has been in previous years, which is completely understandable. But here's what he had to say after the race. We got good points as a team today, so we'll take them and move on. He recovered from a sluggish start, and as I said, the car's still not in the sweet spot for race day. He was a bit unfortunate with the safety car, but he would have probably lost the place to George Russell anyway. He'd have just moved out of the way. Russell would have closed in on him late on, I'd guess. Talking of George Russell, started 12th, finished 5th. So I rate George's performance as a 3. Mixed feelings for George Russell post-race, but he drove excellently and he patiently waited for the race to come to him, which it did. Another top 5 finish, making his start to Mercedes life absolutely fantastic, despite the car not being what they hoped. Let's move to McLaren, and it wasn't really their weekend, to be honest. Lando Norris, he started 8th, which was good, but he failed to finish after that contact with Pierre Gasly. I rate his performance as a 2. He lost out heavily after his pit stop, and then never had the pace to move back through the traffic, which put him in target range for collision with Gasly. He did qualify ahead of Ricciardo again. I can't remember who said it, and I think it's 9 in a row now for Lando over Daniel in qualifying, which, considering that Ricciardo is a pretty handy qualifier, that tells you everything you need to know about Norris. Talking of Ricciardo, he started 14th. He's classified 13th. I believe he crossed the line in 11th. I think he picked up a 5-second time penalty, but I've actually got no idea why. He had an issue in qualifying which kind of left him stuck in 14th. He only had one lap, I think, very, very late on. I rate Daniel's performance as a 1.5 because he struggled to match Norris for pace all weekend, really. The car not suited to the layout at all. Maybe Barcelona will bring better for the Papaya boys. Let's move to Alfa Romeo and Valtteri Bottas. He started 5th, finished 7th. I rate him as a 3. Bottas again driving like a man with a weight lifted from his shoulders. Maybe he really could have led the Mercedes charge post-Hamilton, because there's been talk of how he didn't like the rolling 1-year contract and he's feeling more secure and a little bit more valued a little bit at Alfa Romeo. Now this result is more impressive considering he missed all of FP2, but he did make that error which cost him a 5th place finish, which probably would have allowed me to rate him at 4. But still, P7 in the Alfa Romeo, because bear in mind the cars they've produced over the last few years, for them to be scoring regular points with one driver is, I'm struggling to get my head around it, to be honest, because I thought they were just going to be mired in the lower midfield, and yet arguably this weekend they were the 3rd fastest car, in the hands of Bottas at least. His teammate Zhou Guanyu, he qualified 17th, didn't finish the race. It was a water pump issue, I believe, so I rate his performance as a 1.5. Probably his poorest weekend so far, when it could have been his strongest with everyone learning the circuit as well. It's just tailing off a little bit for Zhou. He had a positive start with some points and some decent performances, but maybe he's just going to get a second wind, and once he's worked out how to operate the car sort of perfectly, maybe we'll see a bit of a renaissance from him. Let's jump to the Alpine boys and start with Fernando Alonso, who started 11th and finished 11th, even though he crossed the line 8th. Now I'm going to rate Fernando as a 1, because, Fernando, this was not good. Yes, 8th place on the road, but a clumsy clash with Gasly before gaining an advantage off the track on the I think it was on the final lap, resulting in 2 5-second time penalties, which dropped him out of the points, bumped his teammate Ocon up an extra place, and it means Alonso loses points to Ocon and remains on that pair of points that he got from the Bahrain Grand Prix. He said after the race he was too aggressive, and I'd have to go along with that. Esteban Ocon, he started 20th, having not set a lap time in qualifying, and he finished 8th. So I rate Esteban's performance as a 3.5. A very nice race, very similar to George Russell. allowed the race to come to him. He had the cracked chassis from FP3, had a bit of a sore body, but he collected P8 after Alonso's penalties and now actually holds a 22-point advantage over his Spanish teammate. That in the midfield is going to be quite an effort to overcome, even if you are Fernando Alonso. Pierre Gasly for AlphaTauri started 7th but failed to finish, so I'm going to rate Pierre as a 2. He collided with Norris and it was a bit, 6 of one and half a dozen of another, really. He was recovering from damage to his car from the collision with Alonso, which wasn't really his fault, and then he ran wide. So from there, it was not really a very strong race, considering both AlphaTauris had got into Q3, so they'd have expected some points at least. Yuki Tsunoda started 9th, finished 12th, so wasn't able to capitalise on Gasly's DNF or Alonso's penalties, and this is more disappointing considering that Tsunoda's actually been driving very well this season. It's just another one of those inconsistencies for Tsunoda, I think. I rate him a 2 as well. Kevin Magnussen started 16th but failed to finish. He gets a rating of 2. He's stuck in the train in the lower midfield after a Q1 exit. Haas are dropping down that competitive order a little bit. Hopefully some upgrades can boost their performance. Mick Schumacher, 15th in qualifying, 15th at the flag in the race. And again, maybe a little bit harsh, but a rating of 1 for Mick. He was on course for his first points and it was looking like a really strong drive, but an error cost him dearly, running wide and allowing Vettel through. Then he ran into Uncle Seb. Some have said that this was a bit of a racing incident. I believe that's what it's gone down as, but yeah, I think he was just desperately trying to make up for an error, and without having really watched it back too much, it at first glance looked at least like Schumacher had dived for a gap that wasn't there, but having watched it back a couple of times, it doesn't look quite so bad. But still, you don't want to be running into opposition in the midfield. And Schumacher is turning into the new George Russell as everyone awaits those maiden points in Formula 1. Just where is he going to collect them now? I doubt it will be in Barcelona. And talking of Uncle Seb, who is actually appearing on Question Time today at the time of recording. Obviously you'll hear this the day after, so if you're in the UK you can go on to BBC iPlayer and probably find it there. But Seb he qualified 13th, but he started from the pit lane and then failed to finish. So I rate his performance as a 2. It was a tidy drive that was ended by Schumacher's ambition to recover from his mistake. Lance Stroll qualified 10th, but also started from the pit lane. But he finished 10th, obviously courtesy of Alonso's time penalties, and I rate Lance's performance as a 3. It was a great result for Stroll, collecting a point for the second race running. Now, both Aston Martins had to start from the pit lane because their fuel was actually too cold. It has to be within, I think it's 10 degrees of the ambient temperature, and theirs was just a little bit too chilled, which can actually aid combustion and give you more power. But yeah, so from there, having started in the pit lane, Lance kept himself out of trouble. That was a good drive. Good drive from Stroll, considering he's taken a little bit of criticism this season from me and from some other people in the F1 world as well. And finally, Williams. They collected a point with Alexander Albarn, who started 18th but finished 9th. Well, they collected 2 points, in fact. I rate Albarn's performance as a 3.5, and he's at it again. The red hair, maybe it's magic. That single point became a pair after Alonso's penalty, and if Williams can improve this car, Albarn picking up 8th, 9th could be a regular scenario. He's really driving well. As for his teammate Nicholas Latifi, qualified 19th because Ocon didn't run, and I'm sure otherwise he would have started last. He finished 14th, ahead of Mick Schumacher because Schumacher had to pit for a new wing. I rate Latifi's performance as a 2. He kept out of the wall and generally out of sight. There was a little bit of a battle with Sebastian Vettel, but that was mainly because he was just stuck in that giant train as well. So they're my driver ratings. If you disagree, get in touch on Twitter, on the socials, or ping a comment in the YouTube comment section down below. So now I'm going to rate the race overall, and I'm going to give it a 4 out of 10. It's pretty damning that I enjoyed Martin Brundle's grid walk more than the race itself. For all the razzmatazz ahead of the race, it failed to live up to the hype as a spectacle for me. The track layout is challenging, and nailing a single lap in qualifying without error proved a tough ask, and that's great. We want the drivers to be challenged. Unfortunately, the way the configuration is currently set up with the DRS detection zones where they were, and possibly the length of them too, I think that scuppered a good race at the front. It may have ended up just making it easier for Verstappen to get by, but it may have also helped Leclerc stay in the DRS zone a little bit longer. Obviously, it wasn't the most exciting race, but that said, if you're the driver in the lead, you want a boring race with absolutely nobody challenging you. And the late safety car gave the Grand Prix an opportunity to save itself from being a complete and utter flop. But other than that, it wasn't really too much to get excited about. You know, I'm not saying that just because I'm not a Red Bull fan, but there just wasn't any competition through the field, and anything that was there, we missed it because of the TV direction, which was just god awful. So I put the question about rating the race to some other creators and journalists, and here's what they had to say. Formula 1 Grid Talk podcast hosts Ruby Price, Owen Medford and Louis Edwards awarded it a 4, as did Everything F1's Tom Downey. F1 Chronicles Jared Partridge rated the race as 2 out of 10. The hosts of the Monkey Seat podcast, Tom Horrocks and Carl King, gave the race a 6 out of 10 and a 3 out of 10 respectively. Tom adding that the TV direction was terrible and rated that element at 2 out of 10. And I have to agree with him there. It was just everything that was happening we missed. There was one point where Leclerc had a run on Verstappen, and instead of following the action into the braking zone, they cut to the crowd. And then they cut back to the action just as, you know, they reached the turning point. And if Leclerc had got alongside, we'd have missed it. Sort it out, FOM. Come on. Now, Jawad Yaqub from the Hit the Apex podcast gave the race a 4 out of 10, as did Matt GP on YouTube. And Matt GP described it as pretty flat all the way through. And Let's Talk F1 gave the race a 5 out of 10, while Channel F1 gave the race a 7. So my overall thoughts on Miami. It was all very glitz and glamour like Monaco, but I think it went too far. There was the police escort to the podium and the helmets instead of the football helmets instead of caps. And like, I'm all for making, like, I wouldn't say it's cultural, but sort of location specific elements to the Grand Prix weekend. So like when we first went to Austin, instead of like the normal caps, a bit like what I'm wearing, they had Stetsons, which, you know, that's cool, but that's just one small element. You don't need to throw it in our faces. We'd had it thrown at us all weekend how great this event was, how much there was a buzz around the place, and there was so much going on, but we didn't really see much of it. I didn't really see much of that. I mean, we saw the chaos on the grid and all these people who, you know, some of them were just a bit rude, frankly. I mean, Venus Williams, for once, actually spoke to Martin Brundle, but then she just sort of didn't pay attention, which is just plain rude. Yeah, really, you know, seemingly these people were more concerned about their own image or ego, and DJ Khaled was doing the another one meme, and he wasn't doing that for the fans. He was doing that for him, to get himself on the telly, to get himself noticed, which, okay, they've got to do, but come on. It was just... Now, the build-up to the race was fine, because a new event should have a big welcome, although a full-on opening ceremony, I think, was a bit past the mark for that. And the race, in the end, will kind of sour it for many fans, especially those who were watching it on TV, as the high-profile parade of celebrities was not balanced out with exciting racing. And we must remember that this is the first race in Miami, and of course Formula 1 will return next year with the learnings of 2022. Hopefully a new grippier surface as well as adjusted DRS zones will go a long way to improving things, as well as some of those safer barriers at the chicane. So it's not terrible. There's something definitely to work with, and it can definitely become a Monaco-like event. It can become something that really works well for Formula 1. It can become a real challenge. If it's super, super hot out there, which it can be in Miami, the tyres could just melt. And maybe Pirelli could be a little bit more aggressive with their compounds. Maybe they could bring the C5 soft tyre. Or maybe they could do the C... So they had the C2 and the C3, and maybe they could not do the C4, but have the C5 as the hard tyre. So teams are more inclined to try and stay on the mediums, which didn't really last very long. And if we'd had to run most of the race on mediums, we'd probably have ended up with a two-stop going medium, medium, soft, which could have been very interesting. You might have seen a little bit more overtaking and drivers really struggling with their cars. And maybe even a variance of strategy. Some drivers trying to pull off a one-stopper, going medium hard, and then some drivers committing to that two-stop. But we'll never know unless we try. So, of course, they are my thoughts on the event in Miami. Let me know on Twitter or with a comment down below what your opinion of the Miami Grand Prix was. And with that, we have reached the checkered flag for another episode. Thank you so much for joining me today. Remember to find me on social media and follow the podcast wherever you get it. Also, make sure you go back through the feed and get stuck into my last two episodes where I shared the top 5 and worst 3 drivers from the Grand Prix Cap ratings so far, which was pre-Miami. And also mid-Miami Grand Prix weekend, I had a chat with Ash from the Outside Line about the F1 sprints. Go and check those out because I think we fixed the sprint format. I'll let you be the judges of that. And if you are in agreement with us, please forward it to the FIA and Ross Brawn and Stefano Domenicali. We're very happy to sit down and explain to them what they need to do to fix it. Now, there's no F1 this weekend, but there is a Berlin E-Prix doubleheader in the Formula E Series, and IndyCar are at the Indianapolis road course ahead of the Indy 500 later this month. It is, of course, the month of May. I'll be cheering on Romain Grosjean in the IndyCar. He took pole at Indy last year before losing out to Rinus VeeKay. Wouldn't it be lovely to see Grosjean back on the top step? So enjoy all of that racing, and I will see you when the 5 red lights go out.